How's things?
What's that?
Apologies for my lateness. Can you hear me or not?
Yeah, I got you. I got you loud and clear, buddy. And this is just how it goes. We got too many links. But first off, thank you everyone for piling in here. Hopefully, we'll kind of get some more as we go on. But there's a couple of things that there's a couple of things that Scott won't tell you during this presentation, and that is just how good they are at their job and how passionate they are about leading the charge in this sport in terms of helping you all do a better job. There's so much uncertainty out there with lifestyle choices, upbringing, education, and then I like to equate it to like I go to a small town and there's a bunch of triathletes and there's like one or two mechanics in the area or old bike riders and they know what they know, but then they teach everybody that. And so this is a little tiny bubble and it's a bit old school and backwards and it's kind of just dated. So Scott and his team are just so focused on the most present day approach to this busy lifestyle
Bracken, quiet.
athlete stuff. I'm going to mute everybody, by the way, so that way we don't get any craziness. But Scott, I will. I'll give you the floor. But thanks for everyone for being here and being patient with us.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, mate. Appreciate the introduction and looking forward to this one. We'll keep it very light. We'll try and keep it as informal as possible. And for anyone out there who wants to ask questions during, feel free to do that. Can everyone see my screen?
I've got her.
Right, you can see it. Okay. All right. Let's do this. Just pull this up. Okay. So, uh, this is what we're going to go through today. We're going to go through some questions regarding sodium and carbs that Nick sent through. We'll talk about some recovery, post-strength stuff, and then obviously periodizing nutrition, which simply means like building your nutrition plan based around your training. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. I thought the first thing I would do though is just introduce the team, and I think it was a really nice segue that Nick said is there are real people behind the Fuelin program, and we try and stay up to date as much as possible. I'll try and get rid of that. There we go. Left to right, my name's I'm obviously Scott Tindal. I'm one of the co-founders. I'm based in Sydney. We have Megan Foley in the middle. She is a professional triathlete. She races for RTS and she is a registered dietitian. She's based in Utah. She recently went over to Paris for the Olympics with her athlete. She's a wealth of knowledge and a fantastic asset to the team. And then we have Dr. Alan McCubbin, who is a researcher and a lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne. He's also a fellow of Sports Dietitians Australia, has worked with the the Australian Olympic and Paralympic triathlon teams. He's published over 35 papers in particular around sodium and sweat. So he's a wealth of knowledge. If you do Google PubMed and put in his name, you'll see a number of studies, which I'll reference today. A couple of his interesting findings from some of his research. So there are real people behind the app and behind the program. And certainly if you want to speak to someone like in the old school way of dealing with nutrition, then there's certainly us that are there to help you. So let's get into it. If I can get into it. Sodium intake. Lovely photo of the RTS team. There we go. Nick, you had a question around caked sodium and ingesting too much. What was it in particular?
Well, this came in from one of our athletes, I believe, that when we were fielding it. So it wasn't necessarily from me, but let me see if I can find out who that was.
So whilst you're finding it, I think the premise of the question was, I think you'd listened to a podcast or something, and they were discussing that individuals who are caked in sodium, it
Sorry,
could
it
be
was
related.
Daniel Welch is the guy who submitted it.
Daniel Welsh. So Daniel, I think, asked the question. He was listening to a podcast and hearing the presenters talk about like those individuals caked in sodium at the end of the race. It could be because they're taking in a lot of sodium and thus excreting a lot of sodium. Is that sort of the premise of the question? Do you remember? Something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what it comes down to is, some people think they are really heavy sweat or heavy sodium loss candidates when they are caked in sodium. And I think there's a little bit of misconception we can clear up.
Yeah, look, your kidneys or your renal system is extremely smart. And what we know is that it will control the amount of sodium in the body. So if you've got excessive amounts, it will tend to excrete more. If you've got a low sodium intake, it will tend to control that and not excrete as much. So there is some science and research around, as I've highlighted here with this study, which was a few years old, but with this study, what they did, and it wasn't a huge cohort or anything, but they did have men and they did have women, but they got them taking in around 6,000 milligrams a day of sodium. And what that did was bump up sweat sodium concentration in the short term. So, yes, if you take in large amounts of sodium, and we're talking 6 grams here, which is a fair bit, like that's 4 packets per day of a pH 115. Well, it's actually 8 packets or 8 tablets of the precision hydration tablets on a daily basis for a number of, I think they did it for 7 or 10 days. That's a lot of sodium to bump up a small change in your sweat sodium concentration. So yes, you can see changes of somewhere, I think, between 10 and 15% in increases in sweat sodium concentration through very large intakes of sodium. But on the whole, that amount or that difference in sweat sodium concentration, by my understanding, doesn't necessarily change that much. So you really have to take in a lot of sodium to actually influence that sweat sodium concentration to make it change. So those individuals you see that are caked in sodium, yes, they may be taking in a lot of sodium, which could theoretically be bumping up their normal amounts, but the likelihood is they probably are fairly salty sweaters in themselves. Does that help with that question?
I think so. And I did just bring Andy Blow on our podcast, I think,
Yep.
a couple weeks ago. And because I do sweat testing and or sweat sodium testing with hundreds of athletes throughout the year. And what I've noticed is most athletes do lose between 400 and 900 milligrams per liter on average
Mm-hmm.
based off of that test. But I'm always like, in the back of my mind, I'm like, what changes that? Is it maybe I have a really high sweat volume loss and that increases my pumping out of sodium content because the volume's also high? And can you train that? And his most recent stuff was like genetically you will be within like 2 to 500 milligrams of loss based off diet and being fit. So if you get the test when you're really fit, you won't change much. But if you go from a very unhealthy state or a very sedentary state to a very fit state, then you'll see some big swings. And that's really the kind of stability within the testing we saw.
Yeah, look, Andy's got obviously a lot of data behind it. I think you refer to someone who's unhealthy. Yes, maybe their sodium intake in the unhealthy state is extremely high. They then reduce their sodium intake, which has positive benefits on, say, blood pressure in particular. And that could reduce their sweat sodium concentration because they're going from, say, 6 to 10,000 milligrams a day down to a reasonable amount of, say, 600 to 800. Yeah, I mean, that's going to drop your sweat sodium concentration. On the whole, for most people, getting one test done for your sweat sodium concentration is enough. You don't need to do it repeatedly. Okay, once you've got it, it's a good ballpark because you have to remember as well with that sweat sodium test, it is an estimate. It's not a given. So the biggest mistake I think people make with that sweat sodium concentration testing is they think, oh, my number is 1,123 milligrams per liter. I need to take that in. Well, firstly, no, that's a number. It's probably more a range. Secondly, you don't need to replace 100% of your sodium loss in each session because you're going to take in sodium on a day-to-day basis through food. And if we're talking mostly American clients here, the amount of sodium in the American diet ain't low. So you don't need to be replacing 1,000 milligrams per liter when you lose it potentially during your session and then pile on top a heap of sodium through your day-to-day intake. Where we would suggest, and this is, and again, talk to Andy about this, and this is based more on the research from Dr. Alan McCubbin, we suggest that based on your sweat sodium concentration, you would start with something like 40 to 60% of that number. So if your number is 1,000 milligrams per liter, start with 400 to 600 milligrams per liter. Now that's per liter, not per hour. Because the other mistake a lot of athletes will make is they'll take in 400 milligrams per hour, but they'll only drink 500 milliliters. So in actual fact, you've taken in 800 milligrams per liter because you've halved the amount of fluid intake. So you've got to factor that in. And this is where sweat rate testing is probably, I think you've got your sweat sodium concentration, great, tick, mark in the sand. Now you've got to work out what your sweat rate is. The way you do that is by weighing yourself before and after sessions, doing it on the bike, doing it on the run, doing it in the temperature that you expect to be, competing in, and then doing repeated tests on that.
Perfect.
And that's certainly how we would manage it as a hydration strategy within Fuelin, where the athlete is constantly documenting their before weight, their after weight, entering in what they've consumed in terms of sodium, in terms of fluids, in terms of carbohydrates, and then creating that database so you can start to build out a specific hydration plan to yourself.
Scott, to round out this question,
Yep.
adjustments. So let's say you're on course for a long day. You're going to be out there for a while. How are you adjusting?
How long's a long time?
Let's just go for full distance, and maybe you're at like
Okay, full distance. Yeah.
13, 14 hours. And how would you adjust if you are having GI issues, or if you find that you just can't take any more gels out there and you've trained with that?
I have a question. The next question is on carbs.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll take that
Yeah,
because I know
we'll use both those.
Okay, because the first question around sodium is, and this is where it is very individualized. So if you look at the research, anything up to 5 hours, probably based on the research, and again, this is not on an individual basis because there are definitely athletes out there who respond very well to taking in more sodium in 70.3s and even Olympic and maybe sprint distance. But the research shows that even with specific personalized sodium intake for up to 5 hours continuous running on a hot treadmill, that it doesn't necessarily make any difference to the performance of that athlete. Now, there was at the back end of that 5 hours of continuous hot running on the treadmill, there was an inkling that blood volume was probably better with those who were taking in higher amounts of sodium, but obviously it ended at around that 5-6 hour mark. So theoretically, what happens beyond that, we'd probably say that having some sodium in there to maintain plasma volume, it's probably going to work. So when we talk about Ironman distance and certainly getting into those longer distance or longer duration sessions, certainly some sodium intake is most likely going to be a benefit to those, especially those who maybe have a higher sweat sodium concentration. For the lower distance, it really comes down to personal preference. As I say, some people will perform very well with sodium on board. Others may take in too much sodium and end up having cramping, GI issues, and things like that as a result of taking in too much sodium. So it's really what it comes down to is practicing in training what you intend to do in the racing. And that's certainly, again, how we would push it in Fuelin. So your question related to that then comes down to carb intake. I think, what do you do? There's all this push, isn't there? I think the question, do you know who this question came from? Which was about, should an age grouper be taking in 120 grams of carbs an hour?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's at that same question from Danny.
Same question. So same guy. Okay. So I guess the question I've got here, and it's always that one. Look, you have to look at, and it's not actual, it's relative versus absolute intensity, because that's what's going to be the difference. I mean, did you listen to Peter Attia's podcast the other day?
Nah, I missed it.
With the Podlicker. He's talking about doing 340 watts of zone 2.
Of course I've heard that. Yes, I've seen clips of it.
Yeah, yeah. So, so he's working at zone two at 340 watts. Now, if we're working at 340 watts, I can guarantee you're not at zone two. Well, the point being here is that it's important as an age grouper and as a pro to look at what's your relative intensity, not the absolute intensity. So if you're at, let's say, Ironman pace and you're at 220 watts, as relative intensity, that might have you at 65, 75. Sorry, lights have turned off. 75% of your FTP, which means that your fuel preference is predominantly going to be carbohydrates. Yes, you're not pushing as much watts as, say, the pros, but the relative intensity puts you in a zone where carbohydrates are your preferred source. So that's the first part for an age grouper to understand. I would imagine, Nick, that you're getting people working somewhere in that 65 to 75% of their VO2 or their heart rate and whatnot when they are racing because they're trying to go fast. That be correct?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the first part. So we know that the predominant fuel source is going to be carbohydrates. Yes, there will be some fat contribution in the early stages. And as the race extends through, carbohydrate utilization and fat utilization after about 3 hours is going to be maxed out anyway. So then you start looking at what are the caloric requirements for someone producing X amount of power. And Alan did a really great job of breaking this down. For a female athlete who's pushing at least 160 to 170 watts, extended for at least 2.5 to 3 hours continuously, they're going to most likely benefit from 90 grams or more of carbohydrates per hour from a caloric standpoint. For a male, 210 to 220 watts, if you're pushing that, you would likely benefit from 90 grams of carbs an hour and above.
Is that relative to their threshold, like maybe their 70 to 80% range of their output?
So if you look here, so watts, so in terms of watts, FTP, their zone factor. So let's say they're at zone three, which would put them somewhere in that 70%. That would then give a measure of kilojoules through the actual crank. So that would be their wattage times the seconds divided by 1,000. The total calorie expended is then a factor of through the crank, which is around 22% efficiency. And then in order to work out your calories expended, you divide that total number of kilojoules by 4.18, and that would give them the expected caloric expenditure. So yes, the percentage of time that they're in their zone or the percentage of like how that relates to their FTP is important. And that comes back to, again, relative intensity.
Exactly. Perfect. I think the number one thing that you got to take away from this too is on race day, the only thing that matters is your pacing and your fueling. Those two have to match pretty well together. And that's why you train those things and you have big days. So Scott's giving you some, you have to be a really scholar in arithmetic now if you want to make this work for yourself. No, it's quite simple. But these things are all, pretty standard in terms of if you're going to put this much power out and burn this much calories, we roughly need to bring in a certain percentage of that back, right, Scott?
Yeah. Look, the other thing that you need to understand as an athlete is you're never going to replace 100% of your caloric expenditure, of your energy expenditure. Like, let's put it another way. Like, do you know what your rough caloric expenditure is per hour at Ironman pace?
I couldn't guess right now, honestly.
What sort of wattage are you pushing for Ironman pace?
I just did 292 watts for 4 hours at Chattanooga over the weekend.
Okay, so you're pushing a lot. Like, yeah, you're probably up, probably over 1,000 calories an hour,
It
probably
was
somewhere around there.
roughly took in about 112-ish grams of carbs per hour for that race.
So you think about that. So like you're expending potentially 1,000 calories an hour with your power. Even if you took in 120 grams of carbs, that's 480 calories per hour. You're in a hole. Now, that's exogenous carbs. You've got endogenous, so the stored glycogen on you, and you've obviously got stored fat. as I said, once you go beyond that sort of 3 hours, you're going to start to use body fat, regardless of the carb intake. And I wrote an article about this. There was a really cool study where they had a trained cyclist taking in 90 grams an hour and they measured their fat max, so the maximum amount of fat that they were burning during a 6 hour simulated race whilst taking in 90 grams an hour. They had peak levels of fat oxidation and peak levels of carbohydrate oxidation. Why? Because the duration and the intensity they were working at was maxing out fat utilization on their body. They weren't consuming any fat. They were just using their body fat, but also using the ingested carbohydrates and probably some stored glycogen because we saw power output start to reduce at the very end. So the reality is, Nick, is even with your intake of 112 grams an hour, plus probably using you were having to dive into your stored glycogen and your stored fat stores in order to fuel that performance. And so again, for individual athletes, think about like 90 grams an hour, if you're pushing numbers like Nick, certainly isn't going to be the number that I'd be recommending. I'd be saying, hey, let's try and get you 100, 110, 120, maybe 130, even up to 140 grams an hour and see how that goes. Now, that's going to be then a case of using mixed carbohydrates, so multiple transportable carbs, maltodextrin, glucose, fructose, in order to allow you to try and hit those numbers.
And I've had to train that extensively over time, working a lot of long 6 hour rides, eating a lot the whole time, making sure my body can handle it. So when you do see these numbers from the race reports that you'll see on social media, raced this far with this much calories and stuff, like this is all at a very trained level. So you make sure
Correct.
that if you've got those big days before an Ironman, you want to replicate it as close as you can, or at least even race week, start to make sure the gut can handle a little bit more during regular training.
Well, I mean, and 100%, Nick, like it's about what you do in training becomes what you do in a race. And I think the biggest mistake athletes make is they do all this training. A lot of them, unfortunately, do a lot of fasted training, go, oh, I don't need to eat this, blah, blah, blah. They come to a race and then go, oh, I'm going to consume 120 grams an hour. And you can see what's going to happen. Like, and you talk about like doing it on race week, too late, way too late. If you
Yeah.
look again at the studies for training the gut, it's usually consecutive days, somewhere around 10 consecutive sessions. Most athletes won't do that type of training where they're doing 10 consecutive gut training sessions. They may just do it on 1 day a week, probably on the weekend. So therefore you break it down and go, well, I've got to do at least 10 of these sessions. That's 10 weeks worth of gut training and breaking it down that way. And again, that's what we would talk about, doing your carb capacity testing. What is your intake on the bike? What is your intake on the run? Quantifying it, seeing how much grams per hour you're taking in with what products like solids. Are you using gels, chews, maybe bars? Are you using fluids? How do you feel on the bike? But probably most importantly, how do you feel with the run off the bike? Because a lot of it, and you know this very well, like you can consume a heap of carbs on the bike, you're nice and stable, everything's pretty good. You get off the bike and go for a run, you're like, oh my God, I don't feel so good now. Things are sloshing around, or I've got like a little bit of queasiness and that. So having that built into the program as well, those solid run off the bikes, not 10 minutes, not 15. If you're talking 70.3 distance, I would be pushing sort of up to, 40 to 60 minutes. And certainly for Ironman, I would be requesting the coach, look, for athletes, look, could we do 60, 90, even 2 hour runs off the bike where it's really practicing that fueling on the bike and then the fueling on the run to bring it together.
Perfect. I think this sequence of questions pertaining to sodium and carb ingestion through the course of long races, I think we tidied it up pretty well. Unfortunately, it's not a cut and dry answer like everybody in the sport would really prefer. It is individual. It is something you have to train for, and you have to test it rigorously in different climates that are going to be probably more near what you're going to expect on race day.
Completely. I think, look, it is completely individualized. Um, I think the most important thing for everyone to understand, and exactly like you said there, Nick, it's practicing in training what you intend to do in the race and bringing that knowledge from training into the race situation where there's no more guessing. There's no sort of, decision paralysis about what you're going to be eating or drinking. You know it because you practice it so much in training. And the advantage of that is you're probably fueling your training correctly, which means the adaptation to training is going to be better. Your recovery day to day is going to be better, hopefully reducing the chances of getting sick, the chances of getting injured, so on, so on. So, there is a lot of benefits to fueling those sessions, those appropriate sessions. Again, I'm not saying you have to fuel every single bike or run. It would depend on the intensity. It would depend on the duration. And certainly thinking about that.
So the number one, I guess, answer for all this stuff is it depends.
The hard answer. Nobody likes it, but
No.
well, it depends, but it doesn't.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
depends on you as the athlete putting it into practice in training. When Nick is saying it's a zone 3 race pace or above tempo type session, and the duration, for instance, is probably somewhere around 70 minutes or above, you're taking in carbs and you're practicing taking in high amounts of carbs to the threshold or the carbohydrate capacity that you can tolerate to make you feel bloody awesome and go really hard and recover better. And so, yes, it depends. It depends on the athlete following the plan. And I guess that's where it works really well. Like if you've got a nutrition plan that actually syncs with your training program, again, it just makes it easy. You look and you go, okay, I'm doing a bike session. Oh, and I'm being told I need to consume 50 to 60 grams of carbs because that's where I'm starting. Okay, let's do it. Let's record that data. You hit end on your Garmin watch when you finish the session. Great, you've got that data. Now you hit end on Fuelin. Once you've recorded your in-session fueling, that information goes back to the coaches, and you can start to make a plan around how you're actually fueling. And it just works like that.
Perfect.
Anyway, next question: strength nutrition.
This was
I think the
from
question,
Mark
yeah.
Bruckner.
So the question was something around: should we be fueling strength nutrition, strength sessions, or resistance training differently from endurance training? I wrote an article, which is there actually. It's in Training Peaks, and they shared a few things on Instagram the other day, which was cool, and gave some nice little carousels around some ideas for lower body weight athletes and then some heavier athletes around what you should be considering doing. So, things to remember with strength training is that if you go into a strength session in a fed state, you will most likely perform that session better than someone that goes into it in a fasted state. That's probably the first thing. Now, there are individuals who can perform weights training very, very well on a fasted state. But if you look at the majority of the data, when we look at a systematic review that was recently done on this, fed state will result in more reps performed, more power output. So that's probably an important one. And that's if you don't want to take in session fuel. Okay, which for most people, you don't tend to want to eat during a strength session. I find it's not something, I mean, I wouldn't be in the gym probably for more than 45 minutes. Lifting, I think most people who tend to stay in there too long are probably just doing a lot of selfies and spending a lot of time talking. I think you can be in and out, whether you're doing a strength session or a hypertrophy session or a power session, in and out in probably around 45 minutes. That's the first point. Second point is if the session contains less than 10 sets per exercise, which again, you're talking sort of hypertrophy work, probably more off season, then you don't need to take in session fuel, especially if you've taken in something as a pre-session snack. You may be doing hypertrophy work, hypertrophy being muscle growing, trying to get bigger muscles in the off season. If you are doing more than 10 sets, which is a lot per exercise, keep in mind, I would very rarely do that type of training, GVT, German volume training, stuff like that. But if you were, then you could consider consuming something like a banana or a bar in the middle of training. Okay.
I also pasted that link into the chat if anyone wants to check it out.
Cool. In terms of protein periodization, it's not required. Okay, and I would argue that protein periodization for endurance training is not required. And I would also argue that it's not required whether you're a female or a male based on your menstrual cycle. The key with protein, as we see time and time again, it is the total amount that you take in across a 24-hour period, across 7 days a week, and across a month or months. It is not going to be you taking in 25 grams of protein before a session and 50 grams afterwards and all that. Okay. Yes, taking in a decent amount of protein after your session is very important. Somewhere in that 20 to 50 grams of protein would probably make sense to maximize muscle protein synthesis. But again, I will emphasize that the total amount of protein you get in throughout that 24-hour period is likely to have a bigger impact on the way in which you respond to weight training or any training compared to just having a simple protein shake after a weight session. Okay. The other cool thing about protein, which we saw recently in some studies coming out of the Netherlands, was potentially, and this relates to timing of meals, is that you could potentially consume 100 grams of protein first thing in the morning or at lunchtime or at dinner. And if that is 100 grams of your total amount, and then maybe you only eat 20, 30, 40, 50 grams throughout the rest of the day, that can have a similar impact on muscle protein synthesis and the way in which you respond to protein. Now, that's all very good from a research perspective, but I don't know about you. If you ever tried to eat 100 grams of protein, which is the equivalent of about half a kilo of chicken or half a kilo of steak. I don't know about you. Whenever I do that, I tend to get the meat sweats. I tend to go into a bit of a food coma. I tend to be paralyzed on the couch. Now, if you've got a second session or you've got a session coming up, I can guarantee you don't want to be eating 100 grams of protein before that session, or if you've got a subsequent session. So in terms of timing of things like protein, the reason we would split it throughout the day, throughout 3 main meals and probably 1 or 2 snacks, is simply from a practical standpoint to allow you to get in total amounts of protein. And that total amount of protein should be somewhere between 2 and 3 grams per kilo of body weight as a good starting point.
Scott, are we still seeing, or are you still seeing, as someone who works directly with high level athletes, still seeing a female athlete require a little bit more protein or not getting enough protein? Because that was kind of a topic for a while from Stacy Sims. I don't know if that was a trend or a fad or if that's real.
Look, again, and that's why I made the point about protein periodization. I know Stacey has said that women can periodize their protein intake based on their period. I just think, as I spoke to, I think Holly Lawrence, we were talking about this, and she was like, "Oh my God, I have enough things on my plate, let alone if I have a period," and then trying to think about reducing my protein intake or increasing it in relation to my menstrual cycle. It's like, just keep it steady, keep it high, and you'll benefit. Now, whether you're a young female or an older female, you are going to benefit from somewhere between 2 and 3 grams per kilo of body weight. So, and that's the same for a younger male or an older male. I would be arguing that there is no real difference, regardless of gender or age, for the protein requirements of an athlete. As long as you're taking in a moderate to high amount, I think you'll do very well, and that keeps it very simple. A really good target for an athlete just to start on, which equates to around 2.2 grams per kilo body weight, is whatever you weigh in pounds, aim for that as a daily basis. What do you weigh, Nick? 165, 100, what do you?
Yeah, about 170 probably.
170 pounds, aim for 170
I'm
grams.
just kidding. I weigh about 150 pounds, man.
Oh, there you go. So sorry, I don't know. Yeah, you're aiming for 150 grams. I take in roughly 180, 190 grams a day. So I'm heavier.
Got to keep the guns tight, my friend.
That's it.
Are you going to touch on anything relating to fat into this equation?
So, interestingly, when you look through a lot of the research, there's not that much research done on the impact of fat and what it does to, say, muscle building and recovery and that. I think the important thing from a fat perspective, and I said they're post-fueling, you absolutely want to make sure you get some carbohydrates in, and you certainly want to get protein in. You don't need to, as I said, periodize your protein intake. Certainly keep it high. Depending on your total amounts of protein is going to be dictating the amount of protein you need to get in those main meals. So for me, main meals, I'm probably taking in something like 40 to 50 grams of protein. For you, you're probably taking in somewhere between 25 and 35 grams of protein per main meal to hit your total target. The carbohydrate element is probably going to be more based around, are you trying to lose weight? Are you trying to improve body composition? Potentially, are you thinking about metabolic sort of adaptation and stuff like that? Certainly, you need to include some carbohydrates after strength training. It's very important for bone health. Most people are just thinking from a glycogen perspective, but carbohydrates will instantly and acutely impact bone health. So if you skip carbohydrates after an impact or a weight-bearing session, i.e. resistance training, or in particular running, if you skip carbohydrates, they can have a negative impact on the bone mineral markers which lay down bone. So I would certainly urge athletes, even if you're on a high-fat, low-carb plan, which I wouldn't necessarily advocate for an endurance athlete either, but if you are doing that, then certainly think about taking in your majority of your carbohydrates after those weight-bearing sessions. Fat, ultimately, look, it's just a case of getting in some fat, and then your total fat intake based on whatever your requirements are. Again, probably somewhere around 0.9 to 0.9 grams per kilo body weight, up to, depending on training volume, it could get as high as 2 grams per kilo body weight. You're just manipulating the amount of fat that you're taking in after that to give you total calories. That is important for hormone function, absolutely. So you don't want to be completely restricting fat. But I think the biggest mistake athletes will make with fat intake is that, oh, I need good fats. So therefore, I'm going to eat a whole avocado. I'm going to eat a whole bag of almonds. I'm going to have half a liter of olive oil on my salad. And it's like, yes, they're very good for you, but it contributes the most to caloric intake. And if you are trying to improve body composition or improve weight, things like that, you still need to be mindful of fat as a macronutrient and its contribution to total energy intake.
Well said on every level. Perfectly. I think we killed this question.
Cool. Rest day. I think the question here was, do I need to fuel my rest days, or how do I fuel my rest days in relation to the rest of my week?
Exactly. I think for this one, it was almost, we probably answered a little bit of already with the previous discussion, but it was like, how important is fueling during that rest day? Should I reduce my intake or keep my calorie count up as my body's recovering from the previous day's thrashing? And if my calories do tend to yo-yo from day to day rather than staying quite steady, does that increase injury risk?
So I think, look, one of the, and this, we often see this in Fuelin on a Friday. So Friday, typically, how would you program Friday? What would you give to an athlete? Is there any sort of,
Yeah,
do you have like,
Wednesdays and Fridays are usually like in between harder days. So Friday's usually a build up day for a big weekend, right?
correct? So what, and we see this across a lot of coaches, they'll do this, that Friday often will have a swim in particular, swim or a light bike or a light run. And often in our plan, like, so we use, as it shows there with the screenshot, like green means higher amounts of carbs. And athletes will look at their plan on Friday and go, whoa, why? I've got a 30-minute swim. Why are you giving me a green day with, 400 grams of carbs? Or in this case, sorry, the light's turning off, it's on sensors. Why are you giving me a higher amount of carbs? And it's like, well, what are you doing tomorrow? And they're like, what do you mean? It's like, well, what are you doing tomorrow? And they're like, oh, Nick's got me doing a brick and it's 4.5 hours long. Well, do you want to go into that underfueled? And they're like, okay. So I've got only 30 minutes of training today, but I'm fueling today to prepare for tomorrow. Light bulb moment. They're like, I get it. And so this is where, when you look at your week, don't just focus on the now. Don't just focus on the day in which you're doing the training. Look ahead 24 hours, even 48 hours, and go, am I taking in the appropriate amount of nutrition to sustain whatever it is the sessions that are being given to me in the future? And that often is a really like a crucial moment in the athlete's nutrition journey to understand how taking in higher amounts of total calories and certainly carbohydrates in preparation for race pace or above sessions the following day can instantly change, you know, A, how good you feel the next day because you're not low on fuel, B, the adaptation to that session, and C, sort of how you're preparing for, eventually race day. Because on that brick, as we discussed in the carbohydrate, you're going to be also practicing in session fueling. So now you're putting it together and going, maybe you're not doing a full carb load on the Friday, it's just higher amounts of carbs. Some athletes will practice carbohydrate load. So now you're taking more carbs like you would before a race. You wake up in the morning, you might practice your race day breakfast again, because you need to start to practice that to get used to what you're going to do on race day. You then go and do your big session the Nick's given you. Lo and behold, the session goes really well. You had amazing power. You felt great on the runoff. And after the session, you actually recover well because you haven't completely depleted yourself of all your stores of glycogen and everything else. You've actually sort of just taken yourself to probably a point of fatigue, but not destroying yourself. And so the rest of the day isn't a write-off. You're not lying on the couch sort of destroyed, and you can function, you can get on with your life. So the long and the short is rest days sometimes aren't rest days from nutrition. They actually might be your most important fueling days when you're looking ahead to what's happening in the future.
I think I've got a bit of an anecdote too on this topic. I think the most punished thing at a triathlon, unfortunately, is the porta potty. Because most athletes, they don't find a sequence of nutrition that is agreeable with their level of stress and their build up for the program, and their day-to-day nutrition doesn't support strong, healthy GI patterns. And I think that in its sense can alleviate so much of your race day issues if you just focus on what types of foods really tend to irritate my stomach, which timing, which quantity, and really start to taper off on those things during race week. Because when it comes to all this rest day nutrition and what Scott was talking about for preparing for those big weekends, you've got like a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you can start to prepare a little bit of your gut for those big intakes of fuel that you want to rely on for that race week that aren't going to cause you to have to hit the porta potty a bunch of times. Because it's a struggle for a lot of hardworking adults who are taking the sport on. And Scott, you probably have to deal with this quite a bit, because if you go to any race, the lines are chaotic, the people are so stressed, and it's normally the biggest issue on race morning is the GI movement patterns. So, do you
Yeah.
have any comments on that, Scott?
Well, I think, and you highlighted their stress. So if in the build up to the race, you have practiced your in session fueling and got that down pat, you've got that dialed in. So that's tick. I know what I'm doing on the bike. Well, I know what I'm doing before the swim. I know what I'm doing on the bike. I know what I'm doing on the run. Tick. Level of stress comes down because you've got a plan. You know how you're going to execute it. Next thing, I've practiced my race day breakfast. I know exactly what I'm eating. I've got it prepared. I'm not the night before going, oh shit, what am I eating? What am I eating? What am I going to get? You know exactly what that is. You've packed it, you've prepared it, you've practiced it. Tick. Level of stress down again. The day before, carbohydrate loading. You've hopefully practiced it once or twice. You understand what foods sit really well with you. You understand the total volume of food that you need to consume in order to hit that 8 to 12 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates. So you know, can you cope with high amounts of rice, breads? What fruits sit comfortably with you? What products help you hit that total amount? You've practiced it, you feel good, you know how you respond to that carbohydrate load. Tick. Level of stress down again. Because stress, as you said, Nick, is going to have a negative impact on the way in which the GI system works. It can restrict blood flow, it can cause nausea, it can cause all like the power of the brain and elevated stress levels in terms of the GI system can be immense. And as you said, you look at those porta potties in the morning and you're like, oh man, why didn't you do that at home? Or why didn't you get all that sorted before? And you can see in the face of a lot of these athletes that they are literally stressed about what's going to happen over the next period of hours. And I think if you can be mentally prepared, but also physically prepared because you've practiced this week in, week out, that whole level of mental stress comes down, which I think ultimately improves the physical stress as well.
Well said, my friend.
Um, so I think they were the questions. Yeah, the rest was just, I think I just had a couple of screenshots of what we do and how we do it in relation to what we're talking about. But um, I think there's a few questions. What's in the chat? Let me have a look.
If you have any questions and you wanted to ask,
Oh, there we go.
go ahead and pump them in the chat. No problem. I haven't seen anything really pop up because I think you've been pretty thorough. But I think what it comes down to is with Fuelin. This is why obviously this technology and I guess education coming together into a very unique platform that triathletes are still kind of being, I guess, introduced to as they make mistakes and realize that wow, this product can make a big difference in the planning, in the day to day, because that's the biggest question, right, Scott? Like, what if I do this or don't do this? And that's why a training program that you buy that's 8 weeks in completion. But what if week 3, day 7, you're feeling off and you've got to skip a whole week? Then that throws everything off. And then that whirlwind of what ifs. And so Fuelin, the app on the day to day, is going to quantify with training, with stress, with notes from nutrition experts. It's going to help you answer all these questions because that's really at the end of the day what the biggest problem is. We have an idea of how we need to approach nutrition, and that idea is black and white, and that is very unfortunate because it is a rainbow of every day is different and you don't know which color you're going to get. And so that's why Fuelin's approach is really good. And it looks like we did get a question that came in, Scott, if you get a moment to read that.
Yeah. Give me, what does it say? I'm just realized my thing's not plugged in. I hope I don't lose. I've got 10% battery. It's all right. What does it say? What's the question? Crohn's. Are there any good GI friendly products, or do I train my GI system the way as everyone else? I'm not sure. Who is that? Who said that? Jesse. Jesse, with Crohn's, what I would suggest is that you probably work one-on-one with a dietitian, probably, so that they can manipulate what you're taking in. There's a good chance that probably high amounts of fructose are probably going to irritate you. Hopefully something like glucose, which doesn't require any digestion, could be something to use. Again, depending on how much you're taking in, that could, depending on your power, the body can cope with around 60 to 70 grams per hour of glucose, straight glucose, before you sort of saturate the transporters. Now, again, you have a disease process, so it'd be something to talk about and practice that. I certainly wouldn't just go straight into sort of 100, 120 grams of mixed multiple transportable carbs, fructose, and glucose. I think it would probably be a case of manipulating those and using simple sugars like a glucose product at the start. So hopefully that helps. Someone like Megan or Dr. Alan McCubbin would be great resources for you to do a consultation with and get into it. I think in cases like that where there are disease processes applicable to you, then I always think it's best to actually speak to the experts who are trained in that.
Yeah, totally agree.
What was the other question? I think there was another
Nicole,
one.
do you want to come on, Nicole, and maybe elaborate on that one? I think I understand what you're saying, but if you wanted to explain it, it'd be probably all right. Nicole is one of our pro athletes on RTS.
Yeah.
Hey, so I guess more in the context of like tracking your fueling and thinking about it a lot. Like, how would you not lose your natural intuition as to like hunger cues and the like
meal times?
Yeah, I think, look, hunger is an interesting one. As we get older, we actually get worse with hunger cues. Same as drinking and thirst mechanisms, especially females, get a little bit worse with that. So Look, the reality is, Nicole, is that majority, if I'm being blunt, majority of female athletes under consume protein from our experience and what we've looked at the data. So I think regardless of how hungry you are, the reality is it's probably more around education. So the average female athlete under consumes protein. And that ultimately, I think, is when you're aware of the amounts that you need to eat and you start tracking that and understanding what's going in your mouth and how far off the mark you might be, that's incredibly powerful. I think obviously we do weigh up, there are instances where people can become obsessed with tracking and food intake, and that's obviously a different scenario and needs to be discussed with a coach or whether it's their training coach or their nutrition coach, and come up with tactics or ways around that through visual representation and whatnot. But in my experience, I think becoming aware of the total amounts that you require and flipping the narrative there. I think the narrative, if we look at things like MyFitnessPal and Noom and these sort of food trackers, is like, oh, you're overeating, you're eating too much. What we're trying to do is actually show athletes, hey, are you eating enough? And let's get you focused on, I need to eat more, especially when it comes to things like protein or carbohydrates in and around the sessions to fuel them correctly. And so I think it's a little bit of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, where you're training yourself to think more positively about food intake, and the power of food and how it can, really be performance enhancing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Scott, can you bring up that last slide that shows the Fuelin app interface? I think Cassie, she probably hasn't experienced the app yet.
Yeah. Is that it? Can you say that?
Yep, looks good.
Yeah. So at the top, just keep in mind just around Kona or just after Kona, we're launching our new app, which is really exciting. So a whole new change to the system and the interface and everything like that. But for time being, at the top, you'll get your daily macros target. You can tap on that. They'll give you target, logged, and remaining. We have an inbuilt AI food tracker called Scooter. So when you tap on a meal cell like early snack, it would take you to the logging screen. Here, you can simply talk or type to Scooter, and you can talk in sentences. So for this, I would have said 2 slices of regular cut raisin toast with 2 teaspoons of extra virgin olive oil. I literally would have said that. It would then log that against what I was being recommended. You can see, obviously, I overshot a little bit, but that's all right. Down, you can see that Training Peaks is syncing with Fuelin. So if I had a session from Nick and it was a run session, it was repeats 800s. It's telling me what the session is, what the target of fuel is for that session in terms of grams per hour, calories, and then from a practical standpoint, also personalized hydration recommendations, because I've done 3 sweat tests within Fuelin. So in cooler temperatures, you can see that my sweat rate is nearly half of what it is in higher temperatures. I can then log the sweat rate test, the carb capacity. I can tap on that. That can take me directly to Training Peaks. And then after that is the remainder of the meals throughout the day. You can see that we give you targets for protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And then you're always trying to hit targets, not absolutes. I think people, like, at the end of the day, with meal tracking, you're never going to be exact, but as long as the totals that you hit at the end of the day are around what we're giving you and you're doing well with per meal tracking, what we find with our experience is that athletes tend to thrive.
That's perfect. And I think that's obviously the point of this whole presentation, is to show that the app will be your day-to-day check-in, where you don't have to have like a nutritionist on call all the time, except for when you absolutely maybe have some stump questions. And then you can message within the app. You see in the bottom, hit chat, can pump a message out, and you'll get usually a message from Scott or Megan or something pretty quickly.
Yeah, you will get a message from one of the team. We have 3 different tiers. So we have autopilot, which you get the plan. You don't have access to the coaches per se. I'm going to say we're pretty nice and we do answer questions here and there. But if you're on Copilot, you have 24/7 access to the coaches through text, and that's pretty incredible service and value for money money, especially if you utilize the service. And then we have one-to-one where you can do things like this and do video calls with your coach, much like I'm sure they do with you, Nick, if they're one-to-one. So we just finished a sale, which if you missed out on, it was pretty big. You had Copilot for autopilot pricing. That was 50% off for the year, which I think worked out at about less than $30, less than $1 a day for, actual access to myself and Megan and Alan on a daily basis for $1 a day, which is a pretty good deal. I'm sure we'll have another deal or a sale around Kona, but for the time being, that's if you missed out on it, you missed out. So.
Perfect. So,
but Nick, there is a code actually. It's RTS 20, I think.
Yeah.
The code, which gives them 20% off the first month. And look, there will be a sale around Kona, I'm sure. But if you want to get into it now, and you can always take on the offer around Kona as well, and we apply that to new members. But I think there's a code RTS20. You can confirm that with everyone afterwards if there is any inquiries, and that gives you 20% off your first month.
Yeah, we'll make sure you guys all have access to that. Also, the video recording that we're taking today, we'll email that out as well. But The big thing, Scott, I get questions about this all the time, is ketones came onto the scene and they were all this, they were there to get you in ketogenesis and keep you there specifically because that was badass. That's what we wanted to be. And now it's more like, oh, but it's a carb transport. It's great for EPO boosting after workouts. Like what's the truth about this in your opinion that we should be focused on with keto, and how should we utilize it if we should?
Okay. I've got 6% battery, so I'm not going to answer the entire question on this. And I'm sorry. Look, the end of the day, and are you talking about a specific ketone, i.e. ketone IQ? Yeah. Okay. It's not a monoester. It's a diol. Okay, that's the first point. None of the studies that have shown any benefit have used a diol. They use a ketone monoester, which is delta, which is the original Oxford delta. That's why it's way more expensive, because it does something. Do you know what the diol does when you take in the amounts that they recommend that you take in? It gets you pissed. It has the same effect as alcohol. Do you want to be riding a bike drunk? I don't know about you, but that buzz you're getting is literally an alcoholic buzz. So I'll just leave that with you.
I haven't taken enough of it.
You're taking 32 grams at the recommended dose of what they're saying for ketone IQ, and I'll probably get hung out to dry saying all this, but happy to. And I mean, there's a cool study showing the effect of this, where the number of dropouts and the number of symptoms reported was due to effectively the intoxication. So, yeah, look, I think be aware of what you're taking in. There is a difference in ketones. Not all ketones are made the same. Sometimes what you get is what you pay for.
How about the good ones?
Look, I was talking to the guys from Delta G the other day. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I'm interested in it. Yes, we might play around with it with some of the pro athletes and thinking about it. Some of the research appears to push towards maybe improved recovery if you're doing absolutely everything else and your training volumes through the roof and intensity. That study, which you referred to with EPO, it only showed changes in EPO. It didn't show, and they didn't measure changes in hematocrit or hemoglobin. So the next study, and I asked this, I said, when is the study coming out that's going to show the long-term implications of acute ketone ingestion? Does it actually make a difference to the individual, or is it just a short-term change in EPO, which actually doesn't do anything? So I think there's more research required. In exciting space, don't disagree. Cool. Would I spend all my money on ketones at this point in time if my ideal body composition is not achieved, my ideal health, and all my other blood markers aren't right, that my consistency with sleep is shit, that my training adherence is terrible, blah, blah, blah. There's so many other things I would be focusing on as an athlete rather than ketone ingestion at this point in time. But that's probably my cynical view on it all.
I think that's fine. I mean, I don't see a lot of pro athletes using it on course as much as it's advertised on course.
So recovery. recovery, a lot of them, I think, are using it recovery wise. Again, is there strong empirical evidence for that? No. Anecdotally, maybe.
Perfect. Scott, I know you got to run, but this has been impeccable as always. We'll probably try to do another one of these in the next quarter, or maybe around holidays, so we can maybe have a topic of discussion about holiday off season stuff like that. But
Mate, I'd love that. Hopefully, look, get some feedback from the crew, see what they think. If they want to send in more questions, I love this format, just answering questions. And then obviously I'll remember to bring my power cord next time. I could stay on for a bit longer. But yeah, look, get the feedback. Let me know what they think. We can do. I'd love to. I always enjoy speaking with you, mate. And I think this format's fantastic. So let's do another one. Yeah, happy to do another one next month or whatever.
okay. All right. Thanks everyone for chiming in. I'll be on until everyone leaves, but Scott, thanks so
Yep.
much for your time, my friend.
Thanks, my man. See you guys. Bye.
Thanks for coming on, everybody.